Eva, and here at the Charm of It, I love to celebrate the lighter side of board games. I prefer games that fit into my life instead of ones that require my life to fit around them. And in these reviews, I'm hoping to help you decide if a game fits into your life or not. To that end, I'll talk about what makes it fun to play and also how simple it is to get it off the shelf and onto the table. I don't go into a lot of detail about the rules, but I always include a link to a rules video down below in case you're interested. Today, I will be talking about Pandemic Iberia, which is a much bigger box than most of the games that I play, but I really love this one, and I'm looking forward to telling you why. Pandemic Iberia is a cooperative game, which means that all of the players work together in order to defeat the game itself. I love this type of play because I find that it creates this wonderful sense of camaraderie around the table. You're all working together and exchanging strategies and ideas. And I just love how close you feel to your fellow players. Even when things go terribly wrong in the game, you're all groaning and moaning and horrified because you're all in it together. So I love that aspect of Pandemic Iberia. I also really enjoy the gameplay itself. It presents this very intriguing puzzle that's made up of several different aspects, and all the players certainly have to work together, and you're trying to balance your overarching large goals that will win you the game with also trying to make sure that you're keeping on top of all of these little emergencies that are happening around the board so that you don't lose the game. And I just find that it gives a really enjoyable amount of challenge without feeling completely overwhelming. So I love Pandemic Iberia because it makes me feel close to whoever I'm playing with and gives me an interesting puzzle to work on in the meantime. I find Pandemic Iberia to be quite balanced. These 7 characters all have different special powers, and each of those is useful in its own way. So when you're playing with multiple people, everyone gets their own role, and I don't feel like any of the roles are significantly more powerful than any of the other ones, which is nice. There aren't any cards that are going to overwhelmingly affect the game for either good or bad, and it just feels as if everything is quite well balanced and you're not going to get a lot of surprises. It's just a matter of whether the odds are going to go in your favor or not sometimes. As far as balancing between the human players and the game itself, I think that because there are multiple difficulty levels included, that is also quite well balanced. It took us, I think, 3 sessions to win our first game. But once you start to figure out how it works, then your victory odds will go up, and then if you want more of a challenge, you can increase that according to the rulebook. So overall, I would say that Pandemic Iberia is a well-balanced game, both between the human players and what each of them are going to be able to do, and between the team of humans and the board game that they are opposing. Pandemic Iberia has quite a bit of variability built into the box. First of all, on the player side, there are 7 different characters that you can play, and each one of those has their own special power. These powers are quite strong, and you will end up using whichever one you have frequently, and so the different combinations of characters end up shaping the strategies that you use to win that particular game session. I really enjoy this because it means you're not just doing the same thing every time. There are also 15 different event cards, of which you use 4 to 6 depending on how many players you're playing with. So you will see different cards in the deck each time as well, which is nice. However, it also includes other variability options. First, you can choose the difficulty from 3 different levels, which I really appreciate, not only because it means that you're not completely overwhelmed when you first start playing the game, but also because it means that you can kind of match the difficulty to whatever mood you're in when you pull out the game. Then there are 2 other different ways to play that make the diseases that you're trying to research behave differently. These are variations on the game that have a historical basis, which I absolutely love, and they just provide other ways to make for a different session that feels like a different type of game. So I would say that Pandemic Iberia, their designers put a lot of thought into trying to give you as much game as possible and to give you as many different ways to play it as you can, all in the box. I find that the pacing in Pandemic Iberia can really vary from game to game, and that's because depending on the cards you draw and the characters that you're playing, you're going to have different strengths or weaknesses, and that might create a lot of emergencies in the beginning, or it might create a gradual ramp up until at the end you're just desperately trying to research that last cure before the emergencies take over the board. Either way, I really enjoy the pacing. I don't get bored while playing this game, and I like the variety between when it suddenly feels like there's an emergency and everything is going wrong to the more laid-back rounds where you're just kind of working towards your main goal. I do think that when I was first playing the game, the pacing felt like a bit more of a challenge. I felt quite overwhelmed by how quickly it feels like the disease is spread. But once you've played a few times and you realize that that's just part of the game itself, then I think the pacing is very appealing. I really love the aesthetics of Pandemic Iberia. It's set, obviously, in Spain and Portugal in the 19th century, and so the colors they used all feel quite muted and historical, which I love. Here is part of the game board, and here's another part, so you can get a sense of how lovely those colors are. There are also the card backs, all have different kind of tile themes, and so the whole game just fits together into this absolutely beautiful, old-fashioned kind of aesthetic, which really appeals to me personally. Almost all of the components that you get are also made, they're wooden instead of plastic. There are 2 cardboard ones, but everything is wooden. There's no plastic in the game, and I also think that that really helps you feel more like you're playing an older game and helps fit kind of the theme that this game has. I just find it is a really pretty game, and I love to set it up and just kind of admire the map and all the colors, and I think it's really beautiful. Pandemic Iberia is a more complex game than some of the ones that I've reviewed previously on this channel, so the logistics for playing it are a little more complicated. However, I find that the increase in interest in the gameplay itself is more than a reward for the slight increase in logistical complexity. As far as setup time go, it takes between 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how familiar you are with the game. In addition to putting out the board, you do need to create a deck of cards, shuffle some other cards, and put some cubes on the board. So once you're familiar with it, it's going to take more towards the 5-minute end. But especially in those first games, it might even take you a little longer than 10 minutes. It is not a very portable game. I showed you the box size, and the box itself is quite heavy. So this isn't one that I would throw in a tote bag and bring to a cafe. As far as table space goes, you need space for the board, which is just the same size as my coffee table, but you also need space for the cubes and a couple other things. So I would say a regular table is probably going to be your best bet for playing this game on. As far as playtime itself goes, the box suggests 45 minutes, and most of my games do fit that category. However, I'm also mainly playing as a 2-player game. I think that the more players you add, it's going to slightly increase your play length, just because this is a cooperative game. You're all going to want to discuss ideas, so there's probably going to be a little more talking during everyone's round. I find that the rulebook for Pandemic Iberia is quite clear. This was one of the first games that I ever played, and so when I read the rulebook, I did not have much experience with modern board games at all, but I still found it understandable, and even if everything it was telling me didn't necessarily make sense, I could follow what it told me, and it made the game work. So from that aspect, it is definitely a solid rulebook. The rules can feel quite complex the first few games if you're not familiar with modern board games. However, once you've played it a few times, you'll really get into the rhythm, and I don't have to refer to the rulebook for playing after just maybe 3 or 4 games. I've got those rules down. I did have to refer to the rulebook a little more before I remembered everything for setup, but these days I've even got that down, so I don't have to refer to the rulebook anymore. In addition to that, they include player aids, which list all of the actions that players can do, and on the board itself are the directions for what you need to do in every round. And so they've made this a very user-friendly, player-friendly game so that it's as simple as possible to play. As I said, the rules are more complex than some of the other games I've played, but since it's since it's a cooperative game, you can teach new players as you go because you're all working together. So that makes it a little easier to digest. Finally, I like to address how much mental effort a game requires. I realize that this is a very subjective discussion, but it's one that is important for how frequently games get played in my household. I would say that Pandemic Iberia falls towards the middle of the scale, tending a little more towards the complex. Sometimes we play this as a weeknight game if we have more energy than a typical weeknight, especially now that we've played it enough times that we know our basic strategy for winning. The first few times we played, this game took a lot of concentration, and we did not win the first few times, so it also took, a little bit of moral stamina. But once you become more familiar with how the game works and how you should best be optimizing your own turns, then it becomes a less mentally rigorous game. It still always provides a fun brain workout, and depending on how the cards come out, it can still provide quite a challenge even on the easiest setting. But over time, this definitely becomes a simpler game that requires less concentration. I really enjoy this one. I have always found it fun, even when I was losing, and I think that's because it puts you on a team with everyone that you're playing with, and I just really enjoy that as a kind of game and social experience. So I am happy to play this most times, but if I'm very tired or very low energy, or just if I don't have my full brain capacity, perhaps I've been drinking because it's a Friday night, then this is not one that I would pull out. So I would not call this a Netflix alternative, but it's also not a hardcore brain burner. It's somewhere in the middle once you've played it a few times. Overall, I really love Pandemic Iberia. As I've mentioned, it was my introduction to modern board games, and even though I found the first play or two a little bit overwhelming, I was already completely hooked, and within just a few plays, I found my rhythm, and now I really love pulling it out. And even having played quite a few games since then, this is still one of my absolute favorites. I love the cooperative nature of it, so that I get to work with my fellow players. I also think that the puzzle it presents is really intriguing, and I'm really looking forward to getting to try out some of the variations that change how the diseases function and just kind of change up the puzzle a little so that it's an even new experience. I also absolutely love looking at this one, which is a pretty major factor for me in whether I enjoy a game or not. And so overall, this is probably my favorite cooperative game that I've ever played. I would just like to note that I don't usually talk about price points in the video, but I include the retail price at the picture at the end. I was really surprised to discover that this suggested retail price is $50 because it's usually on Amazon for between $22 and $25, and at that price, it is an absolute steal for all of the value that's in the box. Because all of the components are wooden and the beautiful aesthetics and the amount of variation built into the game, I think that even at $50, it's fairly priced. But I just want to let you know, in case you see that $50 mark and think it's not for you, that online retailers tend to discount this one quite heavily compared to a lot of board games. Not sure why. So if you are looking for a cooperative game that is more of a challenge than Forbidden Island, but still lets you work together with other players and lets you ramp up the difficulty as you keep going and gives you a lot of room for growth, I highly recommend Pandemic Iberia. Till next time, happy gaming!